So if I may, I would like to introduce Professor McGrath. We are very fortunate this afternoon to have as our keynote speaker for the Mathieu Bell Conference, Professor Alister McGrath from Oxford University. He will be presenting today his argument for the importance of bringing the territories of human reason into dialogue with one another. Those are some of the things that we have already been talking about in our sections this morning. Professor McGrath is extremely well known in the Anglo-Saxon world and well known here in Slovakia as well, especially in Protestant and in theological communities. He holds, I think still holds, the Andreas Idrias Professorship in Science and Religion at Oxford University and is the director of the Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion, which I mentioned this morning. It's the organization which has sponsored or provided the grant for our conference. Professor McGrath has been a leading Christian thinker, shaping, among other things, the way we approach the relationship between science and theology. Beyond his qualifications and his writings, which all served as an inspiration for our conference, it is Professor McGrath's own personal story which inspired us to take the bold step of inviting him to participate as our plenary speaker. Professor McGrath started his academic career in the natural sciences and biophysics as an atheist. During his studies, he experienced what he calls an intellectual conversion and then turned his attention to theology and intellectual history. He has earned his PhDs in all three of those areas. So the fact that Professor McGrath has personal experience as an atheist and a Christian and professional experience in the sciences and religion makes him the ideal person to speak to us today as we have been speaking to bring our various areas of expertise into dialogue on questions such as transhumanism, cosmology, COVID-19 in Slovakia, and epistemology. Professor McGrath, this is where I would turn to you if you were here personally, at least through the camera I can. We want to thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I know that you have a lot of speaking engagements right now. We know that you are transitioning to retirement, and I think you have a kind of celebration coming up in July in that regard. What I'm hoping is that this little conference at this little university, in this little city, in this little country, can also be an expression of tribute to you and your influence that has reached even this far. So thank you, Dr. McGrath, for being with us today. Thank you for your decades of service, and we welcome you heartily to the Mathieu Bell Conference.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a very great pleasure to be able to speak at this conference on science and religion and humane philosophy in Slovakia. My theme in this lecture is the importance of bringing the territories of human reason into conversation with one another to help us in our quest for understanding and wisdom. So, how can the insights of one intellectual discipline be connected up with those from other disciplines? How can the humanities engage with and enrich the natural sciences? How might the natural sciences relate to religion? And how might this help us develop a humane philosophy? Now, in recent years, there's been growing interest in trying to find some intellectual framework that respects disciplinary diversity on the one hand, while allowing an integration or a correlation of their insights on the other. And I explore these themes in two of my books, The Territories of Human Reason, published in 2019, and Natural Philosophy, which will be published later in 2022. So here's the question. Can we think of our universe as a coherent whole, capable of being represented by a single grand theory? Or is it so complex that the most we can hope for is fragmented insights that can only be partially integrated? Was the quantum theorist David Bohm right in suggesting that there's a deeper, hidden, what he called an implicate order underlying the explicate order of physical appearances? And the classic question about the wholeness of nature continues to be debated to this day. Yet, while the pursuit of a unified theory of knowledge remains attractive, one of the most noticeable features of modern academic life is a trend towards the fragmentation of previously unified disciplines, such as psychology. And this is often accompanied by a more general sense of disciplinary isolation, in which scholars who are embedded in one specific field of studies find themselves feeling disengaged from a wider academic culture. And academic researchers often speak of a sense of working in a disciplinary silo or an intellectual ghetto, which is disconnected from other fields of academic endeavor. Finding a way of respecting the distinctiveness of each academic discipline while believing each is still part of a greater whole might reduce a sense of isolation on the part of individual scholars. It might enable shared approaches to the fostering of wisdom, and it might help us to regain a sense of coherence within the human quest for knowledge. Now, in recent years, there's been a growing interest in trying to find some intellectual framework that respects disciplinary diversity on the one hand, while permitting some degree of integration or correlation of their insights on the other. But let me begin by acknowledging that some people argue that conversations of this kind are not possible or are inappropriate. Let me, if I may, note two particularly important criticisms that are often made of interdisciplinary dialogue. Both of these reflect the deeply questionable belief that it's necessary to demarcate the natural sciences as favored rigorous disciplines, distinguishing them from the supposedly less competent disciplinary rivals in humanities, and thus protect them from the risk of intellectual contamination. So first, some would argue that any attempt at engaging in constructive interdisciplinary dialogue is impossible or pointless. And this often reflects a pragmatic judgment that these conversations are likely to be sterile, or a more dogmatic refusal to engage in conversation with anyone on account of a belief that our own disciplinary commitments make this kind of dialogue professionally illegitimate or intellectually invalid. And the biologist Stephen Jay Gould's concept of non-overlapping magisteria is an example of such an approach, developed in this case with debates concerning the field of science and religion in mind. And although it's framed in terms of maintaining and respecting intellectual and professional integrity in both of these intellectual fields, Gould's approach in effect makes dialogue pointless. For Gould, these disciplines are totally separate enterprises and they cannot interact meaningfully with each other. And second, some argue that their own specific discipline can answer all meaningful questions about life, so that there's no point in consulting other disciplines. And we often find this view within forms of scientific populism, such as those developed by Richard Dawkins and others, which generally involve the assertion that science has made philosophy redundant. Stephen Hawking, for example, declared that philosophy is a waste of time and philosophers are a waste of space. Science can answer all our meaningful questions far more effectively and reliably than philosophy or theology. Now, at a more academic level, this attitude is often encountered in the movement that we now know as scientism, which can be defined as a totalizing attitude that regards the natural sciences as offering the only reliable form of human knowledge. Now, that's a problematic statement, as many have pointed out, because scientism actually makes second-order philosophical claims about science which cannot be verified empirically, and hence, by scientism's own standards, cannot be regarded as reliable knowledge. Now, scientism has become the philosophical basis of the new atheism, the populist atheist movement that flourished from about 2006 to about 2018, given intellectual leadership by Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. Yet, humane philosophers like Roger Scruton have pointed out how scientism suppresses the subjective aspects of human existence. Scientism thus offers a reduced, a diminished account of what it means to be human which cannot sustain a meaningful life. And it seems to me that the intellectual overreach of the new atheism, which eventually led to its unraveling in the late 2010s, was mainly the result of its unwise embrace of scientism, which turned out to be vulnerable to charges of superficiality and intellectual circularity. Now, in what follows, I'm going to make the case for dialogue across disciplinary boundaries and explain how this might take place and how it might lead to the flourishing of human wisdom and understanding. So let me begin my reflections with a comment from Ian McGilchrist, author of the highly influential work, The Master and His Emissary. As a psychiatrist and a philosopher, McGilchrist makes the point that human beings seem to want to take our world to pieces so that we can understand how it works and then put it back together again so that we can see what it means. And there's a complex and important interaction between our inclination to dissect and our desire to make whole. So here's what McGilchrist himself says. Our desire, our talent for division, for seeing the parts, is of staggering importance, second only to our capacity to transcend it in order to see the whole. Let me say it again, because I think it's very important for my theme in this lecture. Our talent for division, for seeing the parts, is of staggering importance, second only to our capacity to transcend it in order to see the whole. So what he's saying is that we need to hold together the objective and subjective aspects of
Recording
human
in
existence.
progress.
Now, there are 2 points here, both of which I shall engage in this lecture. First, we desire to see the individual parts of our world and respect and celebrate them. And second, we try to find some way of bringing these individual parts back together again so that we can see the whole in a new and more appreciative way. And in this lecture, I shall celebrate and encourage interdisciplinary collaboration, while at the same time exploring how some of the challenges arising from this disciplinary focus might be engaged, based on the belief that some form of unification, or at least coordination of knowledge, is a desirable outcome. Now, there's growing interest in interdisciplinarity as an important strategy for engaging these concerns about disciplinary fragmentation and encouraging a grand quest for unified knowledge. And the interface of science and religion, which, as you know, is my specialist area of teaching and research at Oxford University, is an ideal case study to consider for these purposes, both in terms of the intellectual challenges that it raises and the potential benefits that it offers. But let me begin by considering why we need to use multiple methods and approaches to make sense of our world, including, but not limited to, those of the natural sciences. There are many practical and theoretical problems associated with interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary research or conversations. Yet perhaps the most significant of those difficulties is theoretical, namely that different epistemic communities have their own distinct views on how to secure reliable knowledge about their specific research objects. And any attempt to bridge disciplines like science and religion has to begin from the explicit recognition of the role of discipline-specific research methodologies in human knowledge production. And that has strongly negative implications for universalizing accounts of human knowledge using a single principle of knowledge, which of course was one of the leading themes of the 18th century Enlightenment, and that is now regarded as being deeply problematic. Now, it's widely agreed that the natural sciences use a plurality of methods, each of which has been developed for a specific scientific task. Ontology determines epistemology. In other words, the distinct nature of an object determines how we investigate it and the form of knowledge that results from this investigation. The British biologist Stephen Rose, reflecting on the complexity of the scientific task of engaging and explaining our world, drew a conclusion that he believed was widely shared among reflective scientists. Let me quote what he says, as I think it's an important point. As a materialist, as all biologists must be, I am committed to the view that we live in a world that is an ontological unity, but I must also accept an epistemological pluralism. So Rose argues that we cannot reduce all cognitive activity to a single fundamental method, as some scientists suggest, but have to use a range of conceptual toolboxes which are adapted to specific tasks and situations to give us as complete an account as possible of our world. We may live in a world that is an ontological unity, but this world is investigated and represented on the basis of an epistemological pluralism, offering us a bricolage of unintegrated insights and perceptions arising from different disciplinary or cultural perspectives on our world or scientific engagement with its different levels. Now, most people would argue that reality is so complex that we need different research methods to investigate it properly. No single research method is good enough to do justice to the complexity of a natural world or to the world of human thought and social relationships. There is no universal sovereign republic of reason. Rather, there is an array of distinct epistemic territories and communities. So are these territories and communities totally independent and isolated, or can they collaborate with each other? Is there some way in which we can hold their different perspectives together in a richer whole? Some philosophers of science tell us we'll just have to learn to live with a plurality of insights concerning our world. For example, Nancy Cartwright invites us to think of a patchwork quilt of knowledge, made up of different individual local patches of insight which cannot be integrated. But most, I think, feel that while individual disciplines offer us their own distinct thoughts about our world, there has to be some way of weaving these insights together. Now, one of the most interesting attempts to engage this point is due to the philosopher Mary Midgley. And Midgley's strongly anti-reductionist agenda leads her to affirm the integrity of individual disciplines, while nevertheless holding that their outcomes could somehow be combined or correlated. Now, Midgley studied philosophy at Oxford after the Second World War, and she rose to become one of Britain's most respected public philosophers. And Midgley highlights the intellectual impoverishment and distortion which will inevitably result from attempting to limit our knowledge and understanding of the world to that which arises from a single disciplinary approach. So listen to what Midgley has to say on this, and I quote from her now. No one pattern of thought, not even in physics, is so fundamental that all others will eventually be reduced to it. Instead, for most important questions in human life, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together. Now, Midgley's method of mapping reality recognizes that we have to face up to the fact that the many levels and aspects of our complicated world can never be completely captured by any single research methodology. And she offers us a plausible, visible framework for holding together a plurality of partial insights drawn from different disciplines, namely, using multiple maps to represent a complex reality. Now, Midgley seems to have borrowed this idea from the British physicist John Zeeman, who she knew well. So let me quote from one of her articles on this point. This is what she says. Zeeman developed a metaphor of knowledge as the use of maps, not of one map, but of a collection of maps, all of them incomplete, which together gradually shape our understanding of a new piece of country. By bringing those maps together and constantly improving them, he said, in time we build up a composite picture which brings us closer and closer to what the outside world is actually telling us. Now, while Midgley is aware of a legitimate use of reductionist strategies in the natural sciences, she resists any attempt to reduce reality to what any single research method can disclose by itself. And for Midgley, our research methods must be adapted if they're going to cope with the vast world we're attempting to understand. No single research method or way of thinking will be able to do justice to the complexity of reality. I think our point is fair and will be endorsed by most natural scientists. For example, the biologist Stephen Rose, as I noted a moment ago, holds that while the natural sciences explore a world that represents an ontological unity, they must adopt an epistemological pluralism in investigating it. So different research tasks demand different toolboxes, each adapted to the task in question. And so they yield a plurality of different, though not for that reason inconsistent or incompatible, outcomes. So Midgley is clear, we must use different methods if we're going to attain a meaningful understanding of our world. But how do we weave these outcomes together into a single whole? Are we limited to a simple pluralism, the recognition of multiple accounts of our world? Or is there some plausible means of achieving some degree of unification or coordination of these accounts? And she summed up this dilemma well in her final book, What is Philosophy For?, published in 2018. I'm going to quote a few sentences from this book, as I think they are very helpful. Here's what she says. On the one hand, I want to emphasize that there really is only one world, but also on the other, that this world is so complex, so various, that we need dozens of distinct thought patterns to understand it. We can't reduce all these ways of thinking to any single model. Instead, we have to use all our philosophical tools to bring these distinct kinds of thought together. So for these reasons, Midgley suggests we should use multiple maps, each of which is incomplete in itself, in our attempts to make as much sense as we can of our world and live meaningfully within it. So consider an atlas, which provides us with many maps of a region, for example, North America or Europe. But why do we need multiple maps of such landscapes in the first place? Well, Midgley, in dealing with this objection, points out that different maps provide different information about the same reality. We need multiple mappings of reality because each of these mappings is incomplete and focuses on some specific question that's being asked. So listen to this extract from Midgley, which I think makes this point clear. Here's what she says. No map shows everything. Each map concentrates on answering a particular set of questions. Each map explains the whole only in the sense of answering certain given questions about it and not others. Each set of questions arises out of its own particular background in life, out of its own specific set of problems, and needs answers relevant to those problems. Now, Midgley's point here is that there's only one world, but a big one. It needs many maps to do justice to its vast scope and range, and to the multiple interests and concerns of the people who will use these maps. So, a physical map of Europe shows us the features of its landscapes, but a political map of Europe shows the borders of its nation states. Now, the first might be useful to a tourist who's interested in mountain scenes, but the second will be useful to a refugee seeking asylum. Now, for Midgley, each map makes sense of the whole landscape only by answering certain questions about it and not others. So to get an overall view of this complex reality as a whole, we refuse to depend solely on any single map, because this is necessarily incomplete in itself. Instead, we try to find some way of bringing these maps together so that their information can be harvested and used. A physical map of North America does not make a political map of that same region irrelevant, because we need to map both physical and social realities. Each map answers different questions, and each of those questions and answers are important to different groups of users. And, perhaps most importantly, these maps can be laid over each other so that they cumulatively disclose more information than they can individually. So, how does Midge's approach help us to bridge intellectual disciplines? Well, I think there are two main points here. First, this way of thinking about disciplines, or more accurately, this way of visualizing their relationship, respects the intellectual integrity of each discipline. It does not require that we see one discipline or conversation partner as having a dominant or privileged role, nor does it demand that we accommodate one discipline to fit the needs of another. Politically, Midgley has displaced an authoritarian intellectual monarchy ruled by a single discipline with a confederation of distinct yet coordinated disciplines. And the maps generated by each of these disciplines is to be taken with the greatest respect and treated with integrity, but it is assumed to be incomplete. It is part of a greater picture of reality and does not define that larger picture in itself. However, it can be laid over other discipline-specific maps, which result from different questions being asked and different information being provided. So it seems to me Midgley provides us with an intellectual framework which informs and encourages interdisciplinary conversations. But what kind of outcomes are to be expected from such discussions? So in the final section of this lecture, I want to look at the benefits that might arise from this kind of interdisciplinarity, focusing especially on the relation of science and religion. So why have I chosen to speak about science and religion as a specific example of interdisciplinary dialogue and reflection? Well, first, because it was my own specialist field at Oxford University, and I felt I might be able to offer some helpful insights about this dialogue in particular and interdisciplinary dialogue in general. But secondly, I think, because many people find that reflecting on the relation of the natural sciences and religious belief is important personally. So let's turn to explore this question. To begin with, let's agree that the natural sciences and religion use quite different methods in their production of knowledge. Now, while this has often been asserted by rather dogmatic rationalists to demonstrate that they are incompatible, they are simply different. Every intellectual discipline develops its own distinct method of engagement and criteria of evaluation, and these are developed specifically to deal with its own area of research. Yet, these disciplines may subsequently be brought into conversation with each other on the working assumption that their insights, though derived in different manners and relating to different aspects of our world, might be brought together to lead to an enriched understanding of our world and life as a whole. Now, Albert Einstein, I think, is an excellent example of a reflective thinker who affirms the importance of science, religion, ethics, and politics to human existence. And each of these are different, but that does not mean that they are incompatible. Einstein affirms, as you'd expect, the importance of science, but he makes it clear that we need more than science to live authentic and fulfilled human lives. Science, for example, he suggests, is not able to engage ethical and existential matters. So let me quote from a famous lecture on the relation of science and religion that Einstein gave in 1939. Here's what he says. The scientific method can teach us nothing beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. The knowledge of what is does not open the door directly to what should be. One can have the clearest and most complete knowledge of what is, and yet not be able to deduce from that what should be the goal of our human aspirations. Now, for Einstein, we need a big picture of life of which science is an important part, but only a part. And Einstein's remarks, I think, help us to articulate the importance of interdisciplinarity in allowing us to develop a big picture of life, which of course many psychologists consider to be important to human well-being and proper functionality. But while empirical sciences may show the importance of developing an integrated view of life, they cannot determine what specific form this might take. So, a big picture approach seeks to do justice to the complexity and the interconnectedness of our world without being overwhelmed by its details. It's about discerning patterns and structures, allowing the underlying coherence and order of our world to be grasped. It's about the integration and not simply the accumulation of multiple insights. And many of you will know the French mathematician and philosopher of science, Henri Poincaré. And he points out that science is made with facts, like a house is made with stones. But an accumulation of facts is no more a science than a pile of stones is a house. It's not enough to pile up observations and ideas. They need to be brought together and held together in a coherent whole. A big picture of life gathers, coordinates, and synthesizes multiple aspects of life so we can see the wholeness of our world without losing sight of its individual details. Now, most would argue that the deepest question about human life cannot be answered using a single disciplinary perspective or research method. And it's certainly true. Writers like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins argue that science can provide meaningful and reliable answers to ethical and existential questions. But I have to tell you, both of these have faced considerable criticism, not least on account of the circularity of their arguments and their obviously reductive agendas. And the position I shall take is that the questions are properly answered by the natural sciences, moral philosophy, and theology, while allowing for some degree of interaction across disciplinary boundaries. And this highlights the importance not simply of the correlation of disciplinary insights, but of developing a conceptual framework that underlies and gives legitimacy to this process. So as I bring this lecture to a close, let me briefly consider 4 frameworks that might help us think about how we can correlate science and religion and reflect on their merits and their wider application. So science and religion can be seen as, number 1, offering different maps of reality. Number 2, as providing different perspectives on reality. Number 3, as engaging reality at different levels. And number 4, as representing distinct books that can be read alongside one another. Each of these 4 frameworks assumes we are dealing with a single reality, but recognizes the complexity of that reality and the need for representations of reality that mirror its complexity, rather than selectively reduce and simplify it. Ontological economy may have some virtues, but unfortunately, it also has many flaws. Now, this process of grasping the complex interconnected structure of our scientific and spiritual worlds clearly lies beyond the capacity of any one discipline. It involves the creation of a mental map of reality, which enables us to imagine such a complex yet coordinated reality, and then explore the nature and the implications of its interconnections. We need to generate a big picture of reality which can coordinate its multiple aspects. And my own understanding of how we can correlate science and religion rests partly on what I would describe as a classical ontology, which includes ideas like reality is one and truth is indivisible, and each individual science or discipline aims at truth, seeking to portray accurately some part of reality. But you see, these multiple representations of reality must, if they're all to be true, fit together to give us a big picture that is true of reality as a whole. And the point is, no individual discipline can do this on its own. We need a metaphysical framework and ontology to hold everything together. No single individual portrayal or theory of reality is good enough in itself. It's a snapshot that needs to be added to others to allow us to have a panoramic vision of reality. Now, the four imaginative frameworks I've been exploring are not really precise accounts of this relationship. They're rather ways of envisaging it, allowing possible modes of interaction and correlation to be grasped and pursued. And clearly, none of them is right, in that these are imaginative frameworks that have been developed to help us grasp and understand a complex intellectual landscape. Each has its merits. They're all compatible, so there's no obligation to choose only one of these four approaches and get rid of all the others. From a religious standpoint, each allows the natural sciences to be treated as a potential dialogue partner without becoming ensnared in the reductionist and continuist agendas of scientism. So let me look at each of these four approaches in more detail. First of all, different perspectives. This approach invites us to imagine how a complex structure appears from different angles. And the Oxford theoretical chemist Charles Coulson invited his readers to imagine walking around the Scottish mountain Ben Nevis, which looks very different when seen from different angles. And a total account of this structure requires the integration of multiple perspectives. These are all significant elements of the greater whole. And this approach stresses the importance of offering a comprehensive account of reality and notes the danger of reductive elimination by focusing on only one perspective, only one way of looking at a complex structure. Secondly, we can think about different levels of reality. This second approach recognizes that both natural sciences and religion are stratified. That is, they are multi-layered. They can be engaged at different levels. And in recent years, much attention has been paid to the different levels at which scientific explanation functions. For example, physics deals with one level of reality, chemistry with another, biology with a third, yet these are all different levels of the same universe. The approach treats both scientific and religious realities as multi-leveled, each with its own layer or stratum, requiring its own distinct form of investigation, and encouraging reflection on how these insights might be correlated to give us a larger overall account of reality. Third, we have different maps, and we looked at that earlier in this lecture, showing how Mary Midgley developed the notion of mapping reality as a means of confronting a tendency towards inappropriate reductionism. Science and religion can both be thought of as mapping their distinct territories and allowing their key ideas and themes to be identified and correlated. And just as the superimposition of maps can allow the correlation of physical and political realities, so mapping the domains of science and religion preserves their essential features while facilitating their coordination or colligation. And fourthly, the two books. Here I want to note the great Renaissance metaphor of the natural world and the Christian Bible as God's two books distinct in character, yet sharing the same author and capable of being read side by side to yield mutual illumination. And this metaphor of the two books of God is grounded in the belief that the God who created the world is also the God who is disclosed in and through the Christian Bible, thus encouraging the idea that the scientific study of nature would enrich the believer's appreciation of the beauty and wisdom of God as creator. And it seems to me each of these imaginative frameworks helps us to explain the successes of the natural science while also helping us to understand the limits of science and how we might develop a richer and deeper account of humanity. Each has its own distinct identity or strengths, and they're best understood, I think, as ways of imagining this relationship rather than offering a precise account of its multiple aspects. For example, the boundary between perspectives and levels is more fluid than is sometimes appreciated. And let's remember here, by the way, that the origins of linear perspective at the time of the Renaissance arose from an artistic desire to be able to convey depth in drawing, thus enabling a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional reality. Now, I need to conclude, not because I've solved these questions, but because I've run out of time. In this lecture, I've tried to map out some issues and some approaches relating to interdisciplinary dialogue and discussion, focusing on the field of science and religion. And although I am critical of Edward Wilson's influential work, Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge, I entirely agree with him that we need to be able to make connections across disciplines in the quest for meaning and a proper understanding of the human situation. And let me quote what I think is the best sentence in Wilson's work. He writes, "We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom." And you know, we do need wisdom today. And science offers us knowledge where we really need understanding and wisdom. And as the great German philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey famously remarked, we explain nature, but we understand the life of the soul. And for me, understanding is about seeing the relation of parts to other parts and to the greater whole, reassuring us that they are in some way interconnected in a coherent big picture. So in this lecture, I've tried to provide a modest yet I hope workable intellectual framework to encourage and enable a productive conversation across disciplines to help us gain both understanding and wisdom. And I hope that you may find this helpful in your own situations as you try to develop a truly humane philosophy. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor McGrath. So now we're opening up for questions. If you have a question, you can send it into Slido, or I think it might work, we can ask them this way, orally. Is there... Yes?
Can I speak?
You can speak. I will then repeat the question for...
I thank you. First of all, thank you for a wonderful lecture, Professor. My question is, your claim was that in order to be able to integrate the several maps or pieces, we need an ontology. But you know, ontologies are very different. And can you tell us what kind of ontology, briefly, you had in mind, and why this kind of ontology? Because we have very different and contradictory and incoherent ontological positions. So if you could just get the question, which ontology, what kind of ontology, and why? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm assuming you did not hear that, Professor McGrath. First of all, he thanked you for the lecture. Then he said that it seems that your claim requires that there is a particular ontology that allows for, I have to paraphrase the question, a certain ontology that required in order to be able to overlay the various maps, or to integrate the various maps. But ontology becomes a very messy question because there are competing ontologies. So the question specifically then was, what is the ontology that you are assuming or promoting?
I think the ontology I'm assuming is a rather flexible one. I'm simply saying I do not fully understand what the ontology that lies behind the world which I inhabit, its multiple aspects, is or are, and maybe multiple ontologies, what I want to do is find some way of holding together this world that I see, hear, touch, and experience, and try to understand how its multiple aspects are related together. Now, one of the things I find so interesting about the natural sciences is that actually they do not make ontological presuppositions. If anything, they draw ontological conclusions. They will in fact use research methods to investigate the world, hoping that they will uncover ontology as they progress. And I think what I'm suggesting is that we can in fact use multiple research methods and see what they uncover, and then try to find some way initially of coordinating the insights that they disclose. But at some point, and the questioner is surely right here, we do have to ask, is there a single ontology that lies behind this? Or do we have to work with the idea that there may be multiple ontologies? And I concede that that is a real point. But I think the approach I'm commending is actually beginning from the idea that we investigate reality, including what its ontology or ontologies might be, in the hope and belief that we might be able to find some way of bringing together and holding together these. And it would be much more convenient, I think your questioner is quite right, if there was indeed a single ontology which held everything together. But we can't actually make that assumption without buying into something that actually goes beyond the realm of empirical justification. So I think for many scientists, language of ontology is perhaps a little bit puzzling. But I think what we can do is to say that science is trying to disclose the nature of the world that we inhabit, but is not pre-committed to any specific understanding of what that nature is, except that is our hope that we will uncover this and deepen our understanding of this as the research method proceeds. Now, I realize that's quite a long and quite an unsatisfactory answer, but I think I do have to be pragmatic here and say that if you take a theological perspective, you can begin with an ontological pre-commitment, but not many disciplines would agree with that. I think many would say you have to kind of uncover ontology as you progress, and that actually assuming a specific ontology may be a hindrance to the scientific method. And you may think, for example, of the difficulties that have arisen in quantum theory about its apparent ontological commitments or entailments. I think that's a good way of realizing how sometimes pre-commitments to what reality is get in the way of trying to understand scientifically how these things actually relate to each other. But thank you for a very good question.
If I maybe could, I'm not sure I can articulate a follow-up question to that, but it seems like there is an assumption of an ontology just for the very purpose of assuming a unifying principle that allows us to overlay these maps. So, for example, if I want to overlay two maps, there has to be something. There has to be some overlap, for example, that allows me to put one map on another. Or there has to be some kind of reference point, that unifying principle. So if we have multiple ontologies, or even a flexible ontology, or if it questions the basic that primary assumption of unity. And so then maybe the next question is there some kind of referee or organizing principle or mediator that allows us to overlay these maps or integrate these maps one onto another?
I think that's a very good question, and also a very fair question. And I think one of the points I was making in the lecture is that there is a genuine difficulty here, in that if you are saying there are multiple types or multiple levels of knowledge, at some point you are going to come to a point where you say we need someone who is able to adjudicate which takes priority. I think that that's a weakness, for example, in Charles Coulson's perspectives approach to the relation of the science and humanities, because in the end, you either lay down in advance every perspective is of equal value and deserves equal weighting, or in effect, from your own disciplinary perspective, you say clearly, this perspective, my own perspective, does take priority. I think that's one of the difficulties that we face in interdisciplinarity as a whole, that there are no universal rules for drawing up these maps. There are no guidelines for deciding who takes priority. I think, therefore, it's almost as if we have to say that we rely on those who are engaging in interdisciplinary dialogue to prepare to be receptive to other perspectives, to other levels, to other maps, and see if these help them in any ways. But I think the point you're making is fair. This is a real problem with any form of interdisciplinary dialogue, because at some point a debate will emerge as to which way of looking at something is best. And you can't answer that question without drawing on certain criteria of methodology or rationality, and those are discipline specific. They are linked with specific epistemic communities, and that means that in effect what might seem entirely reasonable to one such community might seem perverse to another community. So it is a real difficulty, and that's why I think the frustration that all of us who are engaged in interdisciplinarity feel is that in effect we are relying on goodwill and a willingness to work together where there are no actual rules for doing this. So again, it's not a very satisfactory answer, but I think that is the reality of the situation.
So it might encourage a virtue of epistemic humility as we approach our disciplines and approach dialogue with
Thank you. Yes.
other people. Mm-hmm. Okay. So do you see this question?
Yes. Thank you. It's a good question. I think that we do have to recognize that there are areas where what one discipline is saying may seem to have an impact on another. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why in his earlier writings, Stephen Jay Gould talked about this idea of non-overlapping magisteria. In other words, each discipline does have its own distinct integrity and is not affected by others. But actually towards the end of his life, Gould moved away from that and felt there was a need to try and bring disciplines into closer dialogue and to recognize both the risks and also the rewards of the kind of dialogue that recognized that one discipline might actually have implications for another discipline. I think one thing I would say, though, is that actually very often when we're looking at two disciplines, for example, neurology and theology, these do frame things in a very different way. They do use different operating conceptualities, different approaches to it. And therefore, actually, there's a genuine question about whether they are talking about the same things. And I think that we do have to try and find some way of trying to translate each of them into each other's disciplines. But I think it is an important thing to try and do, because one of the difficulties is that older models of interdisciplinarity do tend to portray each discipline as autonomous, and it may respectfully listen to somebody else, but it doesn't necessarily need to change its mind about anything as a result of this. And certainly I do feel that being responsive to what others are saying can be very helpful. And that's particularly the case, I think, in the field of science and religion, where there are some challenges, but there are also some very exciting possibilities for enrichment. And I feel we have to take these seriously. So I think that the answer to the question related specifically to neurology is that, yes, these things do interact with each other, and that one of the best ways of achieving a good dialogue in this field is to have someone who is both a theologian and a neurologist. In other words, someone who is conversant with both disciplines, who is familiar with the research methodologies, with the research questions, and can see individuals or two disciplines together if they don't have a good understanding of each other's positions, because communication doesn't really work very well. So that is why my own feeling, and I'm not saying I'm right here, but my own feeling is that interdisciplinarity is sometimes best done through individuals who are able to master perhaps two disciplines and see how they might come together with difficulties, yes, but also with opportunities. But I appreciate that that makes excessive demands, because very often this requires a very substantial commitment to becoming competent and knowledgeable in a second field of knowledge. Thank you for that question. Was the idea of a university originally founded on a similar concept? Yes, it was. I think that if we go back to the emergence of the universities, particularly, of course, in Europe during the early Renaissance, I mean, one of the themes that is here is that university is a community which is independent of the church and the state, where in effect there's a quest for knowledge. And there is a recognition that for pragmatic reasons, we have to focus on different areas of knowledge, different faculties, if you like. But that nevertheless, these faculties need to talk to each other. But the difficulty is that even in the early Middle Ages, you can see a very clear emergence of fragmentation. You know, the Faculty of Arts looks at this, the Faculty of Theology looks at this, the Faculty of Law looks at this, the Faculty of Medicine looks at this. And I think that one of the real difficulties is that in the early Middle Ages and the Renaissance, I think the possibility of of a single individual being able to master a number of areas of knowledge actually was quite plausible, because the knowledge base was low. And then, of course, inflation began. More and more knowledge, more and more books, more and more people to read. And gradually, I think by the beginning of the Renaissance, people realized you could not do this anymore because there was simply too much to absorb. There was kind of information overload. So I think the university was originally founded as a way of bringing together individuals who together, as an organization, would be able to master human knowledge and provide a public demonstration of its importance pragmatically and also personally. But I think we are losing that. I think that certainly many Western universities have really become technical institutions who have lost the idea of the quest for wisdom, and instead they're there to learn techniques that may be useful commercially, and the idea of knowledge as a pursuit of wisdom, I think, is beginning to be lost. I think we do need to find some way of recovering that very powerful vision that certainly was there in the Middle Ages.
So that means we don't have another question in Slido yet. Do we have another question from people who are present? Yes.
I have a question related to this relationship between natural sciences and theology. And I may be wrong, but I feel that the communication is a bit asymmetric. So more the information which is gained by natural sciences is people are trying to use it for theology, but the other direction is somehow less pronounced.
Okay.
I don't know how to.
Okay.
Whether professor feels the same. Or
Okay. So this gentleman has said that as we're talking about a conversation between different fields, it seems that the conversation between science, the natural sciences, and theology is asymmetric, that there is more knowledge going in the direction from the natural sciences into theology than from theology into the natural sciences. Is this something that you would agree with or disagree with or have some comments about?
I would agree with that because if we look at what now constitute the natural sciences, it's a vast field, and actually it's becoming even larger due to disciplinary proliferation, and due also to the fact that we are producing more and more knowledge as time goes on. And theologians, at least the ones I know, kind of way operate from a much more restricted area. So there's an asymmetry here, and I think that's a very fair point. I think it also illustrates a very important point, which is there's a real need for interdisciplinary dialogue within the natural sciences, because very often physicists find it very difficult to understand what, for example, biologists are doing. So I think there's a real need here, but I think it is very, very difficult. One thing I would say is that we haven't really talked very much about the personal motivation, which very often underlies interdisciplinarity. And that is the feeling that, I'm embedded in this discipline, but I realize that I do need to make connections with this discipline. For example, if you're a religious person, it's natural to want to make connections with a natural science and see how that fits into your overall vision of faith. And that personal motivation very often reflects a sort of personal constructed vision of how you hold, for example, science and religion together. So I think the point I have to end by making is that actually there are limits to what can be done in terms of interdisciplinarity, because there's such a vast body of knowledge and such limited possibilities for bringing them together. But I think it's worthwhile. And above all, I think it's really important for individuals who are particularly drawn into, for example, field of theology or philosophy and also a science, to see how these might be held together. And where there's a personal motivation, very often there's a willingness to invest in this by gaining the knowledge and understanding that this process of reflection and integration is going to call for.
Okay, we have run up to the time that we requested from Professor McGrath. So I think that in respect to that, we will end this portion of our question and answer time so that we can let Professor McGrath go after expressing our thanks very much for being with us today. It's hard to express how grateful we are to you for that. And we do wish you many more fruitful years of ministry as you enter into that retirement phase. So can we say thank you to Dr. McGrath?
Thank you very much.